What disturbing thing did you learn about someone only after their death? Story 1. My dad had secretly stashed away what would be worth millions today, all while convincing his family that we were poor and barely getting by. He had complete control over the family finances. We weren't actually living in poverty, but he constantly stressed my mom out over bills, sudden expenses, and money running out. He'd claim he wasn't making enough, that we could lose the house, the cars, or that he might lose his job any day. In reality, he had a huge amount of money hidden in a separate account and was living lavishly on his so-called business trips. There was never any real danger to our home or way of life. He created those arguments and fears just to cause my mom stress and to feel powerful, and maybe for the thrill of having a secret. Edit. Since a lot of people are asking, my mom has passed away, but my dad is still alive. I actually found out about all of this myself during their divorce while going through his things. My mom never told me, and she didn't want me looking. And for the record, she wasn't a stay-at-home mom. She worked incredibly hard to help support the family, while my dad sat around playing video games and secretly siphoning money off his best friend's company. Before we continue, do us a quick favor. Smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. My grandfather, my mom's stepdad, passed away when I was young. He had a whole stock of Hot Wheels cars, so he could always give me one whenever I visited. He used to play Legos with me, and we'd sip root beers while listening to Shania Twain. Honestly, the only stories I ever heard from my mom were about how he and my grandmother met after her biological dad passed away in a molasses accident. I was about 12 or 13 when he passed away. I was listening to a Nirvana song when my mom came in, freaking the hell out. I asked her what the heck was wrong with her, and that's when she told me about him. Turns out he was the son of an S-worker, fathered by one of his mother's customers. They lived in a single room, and he grew up with a dirty cigarette-burned sheet between him and his mom while she made her money. On top of that, he was baptized into the Ku Klux Klan. You can imagine what kind of person that would create. He became a coal mining alcoholic and was a jerk to everyone in town. He got physically aggressive with my mom, her sister, and brother. He essayed my mom and my female cousin, and he used to hit my two male cousins because he hated my uncle the most, and they were his kids, so they stopped communicating with him. His hair had turned yellow from alcoholism instead of white. Despite everything, he was a good grandfather to me, and I never understood why the rest of the family was so afraid of him. Tained the memory of cool Hot Wheels root beer pop real fast. After learning the full story from my grandmother, I found it impossible to grieve or feel any affection for my grandfather again. I knew my grandmother hated him, but now I understood why. Even today, some of his children put him on a pedestal. But I can't. I still can't. Story 3. Before he joined the army, my dad had an affair with a married woman who was separated from her husband. When he came back on leave, she had a son. His son, he chose not to pursue anything because he was young and serving in the army, and she had reconciled with her husband. So somewhere out there, I have a much older half-brother. Not long before he passed away, my dad spent tens of thousands of dollars on women he met at clubs, co-signing for cars, condos, and other things. Oh, and my dad was also bisexual. None of this made me disgusted with him, but it did make me realize he had a whole secret life I never fully knew about. I didn't share any of this with my older siblings. I chose not to tell them because my dad kept these things private for a reason. Maybe shame, regret, fear of judgment, or simply because he didn't think it was appropriate to share with his kids. I was the closest with him, and after he passed, I felt like the guardian of his private matters. I even disposed of certain personal items the night I found him, just to spare the family from finding them later. I will say this, though. I once accidentally shared that my dad had been with 2 women at the same time, just 2 weeks before he passed away. I found that note saved on his phone, and honestly, it left me shocked. Story 4. She had been cheating on me throughout our entire marriage. When the shock wore off, it was replaced by rage and betrayal. I completely lost it and started trashing everything of hers. The only thing I didn't destroy was her urn, which I gave to her parents. I seriously considered flushing her ashes down the toilet, but decided against it. Surprisingly, I got over her in record time. Story 5. My Nana always gave me an uneasy feeling, though I never thought much of it. I just saw her as a regular old lady. That changed after she passed. My mom confessed that my Nana had been a religious zealot who would scream at her for hours over things like wearing slightly tight jeans or letting her fly down, claiming she was inviting the devil. She would force my mom and her brother into the backyard to beat each other with sticks. When my mom's brother passed away in a car accident, my Nana openly mocked him at the funeral, saying he deserved it and that he was burning in hell. My mother had to run away at 18. Nana only calmed down when my mom had kids because she wanted grandbabies, and my mom, being forgiving, let her back into her life on the promise that she would never do to us what she had done to her. My mom may have forgiven her, but I haven't. Looking back, I can see how deeply my Nana's abuse affected my mother's life and mental health. It's awful, and I wish I could talk to my mom now about trauma and everything I know, but it's too late. Edit. For those wondering, my mother has also passed away. Story 6. I received a phone call from my late husband's girlfriend on the day of his funeral. She was calling his cell phone, which I had turned off while he was in the hospital. During the call, she told me that my husband had been paying her rent for the past year. The bank had recently foreclosed on our house. I had no idea he was unfaithful, but she knew all about me. Edit. I've recently tried to start dating again, but health issues that affected my marriage make me apprehensive. Without my children, now young adults encouraging me, I think I might just be content becoming a crazy cat lady. Story 7. My buddy's mom basically fatally injured his dad. 6 months before he passed away, she took out a $200,000 life insurance policy on him. He passed away from not taking his medication, a medication he had taken without issue his entire life. My buddy was away for the weekend and wasn't home when it happened. After she passed, we discovered even more. She had taken out a life insurance policy on my buddy at some point, forged his signature to sign over $100,000 that his dad had left him, and faked illnesses to get prescription drugs. She even kept little notebooks documenting everything she sold and how much she made from it. Story 8. After my father passed away a few years ago, we discovered he had taken out about $40,000 in loans using my name. We share the same initials and obviously the same last name. He had forged my signature, applied for credit multiple times, got approved, and never paid a single dime. Since he was the main contact, no one ever called me about missed payments. It wasn't until after he passed away that we were contacted by the institutions, only to find out the debt was actually in my name. Now my credit record is ruined from years of unpaid loans, and I'm stuck paying it all back. Fun times, right? Story 9. I went through a nasty breakup with my oldest kid's mom that lasted several years. We were never married, and she was honestly crazy. At one point, she even told the hospital she didn't know who our child's father was, just so she could have leverage over me. Years later, after multiple investigations into abuse, she lost custody. In the years after, we kept getting strangely specific complaints about my household, things involving my daughter and her stepmom. Stuff like matching clothes or how we did timeouts. Then 2 years ago, my mom passed. When we switched her Facebook to memorial mode, I discovered she had been bad-mouthing me to my ex for years, basically spying on me and twisting information. I guess she felt sorry for a mother who lost her kid, but it was still a huge betrayal. Even now, 2 years later, I refuse to visit her grave with my siblings, and I haven't shed a tear for her since. Story 10. My aunt passed away recently. I met her when I was 7, and for nearly 20 years, I thought she was a saint. She was my mom's close friend, someone who stood by her through cancer, poverty, kids, and was even there at her deathbed. But after her funeral, I found out she had been two-faced most of their friendship. She would talk badly about my mom behind her back, even to my mom's own relatives, nearly 2 decades of friendship, and she was undermining her the whole time. What's worse is that my mom's own family knew. They heard her insults, they laughed along, and they said nothing. After the funeral, everyone suddenly had something to say about how awful she had been. But while my mom was alive, they kept quiet. They claimed they were protecting her, but really, they were part of the problem. My mom was just being kind, and they took advantage of that. Time, money, trust, all of it. We've had to sit her down and tell her to stop being so trusting, and she has gotten better. but I'll never forget how everyone acted. Now I look at all of them the same way. No one is special, and I don't trust anyone. And when my mom passes one day, none of them will be invited to her funeral. I don't want crocodile tears or fake dramatic displays like I saw at my aunt's open casket. Thanks for letting me get that off my chest. I've been holding it in for a long time. Story 11. I recently learned that my grandpa didn't treat my grandma very kindly. He passed away about 18 years ago, and my grandma passed away around 7 years ago. I was talking to my dad, who knew about how his dad treated his mom, and I found out that my grandpa often put her down and insulted both her and my aunt. He had wanted a son and was unhappy when their first child was a daughter, and even blamed my grandma when their second child, a boy, was stillborn. He controlled their money and was mentally abusive, though I'm told he was never physically abusive. I remember him being grouchy most of the time, and I always assumed my grandma was just a little grouchy too, so I didn't think much of it at the time. I was about 13 when he passed away. I'm told I take after my other grandpa, who would bend over backwards to help people, but sadly he passed away before I was born. Story 12. A neighbor of ours was a strange guy. Not hated, but definitely off. He passed away in his 70s of natural causes. A young couple bought his house and everything in it, since his relatives didn't want to deal with cleaning it out. As they explored, they discovered surveillance cameras everywhere, watching the whole street, which is illegal in Germany. Eventually, they found a hidden room behind a concealed door. Inside were stacks of surveillance documents and far-right propaganda. He was part of the Reichsbürger movement, a group that denies the legitimacy of the German state and fantasizes about restoring the German Reich. Story 13. My ex passed away about a year ago, very suddenly. The only details I was initially given were that he had broken his leg 2 weeks earlier and passed away during a visit to the doctor's office. No one seemed to know how he even broke his leg. The next night, I learned from his landlord's father, who lived upstairs from his basement apartment, that he had still been drinking heavily up until his death. For over a year, he had been trying to convince me he was sober so I would get back together with him. I also found out he was still being unfaithful to his new girlfriend, cheating on her constantly. That's actually how the injury happened. One night, they got into a drunken fight, and that's when he broke his leg. 2 weeks later, he had a stroke and passed away. I suspect his drinking, combined with blood thinners for his leg, may have played a role, but I cut ties with everyone connected to him a couple of weeks after his death, so I'll probably never know the full story. I already knew he struggled with alcohol and staying faithful, but it's sad to learn he spent over a year lying to me about changing for the better when in reality, he was only getting worse. Story 14. My brother-in-law passed away in an accident, and after his death, his wife went through his phone. That's when she discovered he had been sleeping with several other women. What made it worse was that many of them were part of our own friend group, and some of them were even married. It was incredibly awkward and quickly turned into a messy situation. Story 15. My sister's fiancé passed away very suddenly and tragically from a heart attack. She was 20 and he was 23. It turned out to be an underlying condition. In the months after his death, she found out he had been cheating on her almost the entire time they were together, 2 to 3 years. Some women were long-term and knew about her, while others were just casual encounters and probably had no idea. She really went off the deep end for a while. Not only was she grieving the man she loved, but she also had to process the betrayal, and she could never ask him for answers. Silver lining. She eventually grew close to one of his good friends. They bonded through the aftermath, started dating, and ended up getting married. He truly is the best thing that ever happened to her, and she to him. This summer, they'll be celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary. Story 16. I once had a friend whose dad had passed away, and he never really talked about it, though it clearly affected him. Every year on the anniversary of his dad's death, his family would hold a celebration of life. One year, he invited our friend group, and we were all excited to be there to support him. It was only then that we learned the truth. His dad had passed away in a car accident, and he was the drunk driver. Tragically, because of him, the other family involved in the crash also passed away. Story 17. That they didn't die when we thought. Here's the deal. My mom was raised by her mother, now 92, and honestly, an evil old bat, and her stepfather, who essayed her. Where was her dad? Allegedly dead when she was 11, around 1961. That's what my grandmother always said. Fast forward to 2015, my sister is doing genealogy work and discovers the truth. Not only did my biological grandfather not die in 1961, he actually passed away in 2005, and he had 5 more daughters, one of whom he even named the same as my mom. My mom had been completely cut off from a relationship with her real dad by her lying mother, who moved and stayed hidden from him for decades. Years later, my grandmother moved to Texas from Virginia to stay in a nursing home and basically make my mom and dad's life hell. One weekend we visited for dinner, and I dropped the bomb that we'd figured out she'd been lying for 50 years, and she had the nerve to act offended. My dad? He told her to shut the F up. Story 18. My grandfather didn't just abuse me physically and emotionally. He did the same to my mother and 2 aunts, even essayed us. My grandmother knew the whole time, and despite being confronted about it, she did nothing. I still can't look at her the same way. He's gone, but the memories aren't, and she refuses to talk about it even now. To add some context, I was raised by my grandparents because my mother was not in a position to care for me. He constantly threatened me if I told anyone. That fear kept me silent. I had to endure his terror nearly every day because my grandmother, the sole provider, wasn't around much, and he was home all day on disability. After writing about this, I remembered something I'd repressed. I had tried telling my grandmother that he was hurting me, but I couldn't fully explain. She told me it must have been a dream or my imagination. If it were true, I'd be covered in bruises. I never spoke to her about it again. I only know about my mother and aunts being abused because of letters I found in my grandfather's estate after he passed away. They were from my youngest aunt, confronting him and demanding answers. I haven't talked to my family about it yet, partly out of fear of reopening old wounds, but I want closure, even if it might be selfish. Writing this and finally talking about it at 25 has made me feel strangely better. It wasn't my fault, and I know I won't be judged for sharing my story. So again, thank you all for your support. It truly means so much. If anyone has questions, I'm open to answering. Story 19. When I was about 31, I discovered that my maternal grandmother, the woman who practically raised me, had actually offed my grandfather. I was researching my family tree and trying to learn more about my grandfather, who had passed away about 4 years before I was born. We never really talked about him or how he passed away. I found an article about his death in 1978 and noticed a corresponding police report listing my grandmother for an arrest that same year. At first, I didn't connect the dots, but after some digging and a FOIA request, the case file confirmed it. Apparently, my grandfather had serious health issues and had suffered several strokes, requiring a lot of care. One day, my grandmother, overwhelmed and frustrated, snapped and did it. She was arrested, tried, and found not guilty by reason of insanity. She spent time in an institution but was released in 1981, the year before I was born, and moved in with my family. She essentially raised me, and to me, she was the sweetest lady in the world. When I asked my dad how he could let her live in the same home with me knowing this, he just said, "Oh, you didn't know that? Well, you turned out all right." It completely shook me to learn the truth about the person I had trusted as my loving grandmother. Story 20. I recently discovered that my great-uncle didn't die of old age like everyone thought. He was an incredible man, an oil worker in Casper, Wyoming, who spent 40 years in the fields. All that work slowly filled his lungs with cancer, but he lived a life full of joy, kindness, and meaning. Every day he'd drive around Casper, greeting friends, giving away Susan B. Anthony quarters and Buckeyes as little reminders to be thankful and pray. I remember watching the Mir space station pass overhead with him, marveling at it together. He had a deep passion for pre-communist Chinese furniture and taught me and my sister to find the hidden compartments in his pieces. Out of 5, we had only ever found 4 until the day we went through his house after he passed away. Inside the 5th compartment, we discovered nearly $10,000 in cash and a letter on National Hemlock Society letterhead. He explained that he had been in pain for a long time and on a trip to Mexico with his wife had purchased a large quantity of certain meds for him to leave on his own terms. I tried to tell my mom, but she dismissed me, so I whispered it to my dad. I never knew if he told anyone else in the family. My great-uncle was one of the happiest men I ever knew. He owned horses, and every morning he'd check on them by calling and listening for their response before starting his day. It's hard to reconcile that someone with such a love for life would quietly decide to leave it and not tell anyone. Story 21. I found out after my grandfather passed away that he wasn't actually my mother's biological father. He had kept it a secret her whole life to protect her and my grandmother from any pain. My grandfather had been deeply depressed after my grandmother, the love of his life, passed away. They had what seemed like a perfect marriage, and he adored both her and my mother. He was a kind man with a lot of love to give, but he always carried a certain heaviness with him. He passed away, and my mother and I were the ones who found him. What no one else knows is that there was a note. I found it, read just enough to understand, and then I hid it. In that note, he revealed that he had always known my mother wasn't his biological daughter. He believed her real father was likely their landlord, back when my grandparents were struggling financially. He wrote that he never told anyone, not even my grandmother, because it would only bring pain and shame to the people he loved. He found out he was unable to have children just a few days before my grandmother told him she was pregnant. Despite that, he chose to raise my mother as his own and never let her feel anything less than loved. The reason he took his life was heartbreaking. About a year after my grandmother passed, he overheard my mother telling her aunt on the phone that it was becoming difficult having him around every day. She didn't mean it harshly, just that it was hard during a painful time. But in his fragile state, he misunderstood it as rejection. He wrote that if she felt that way, she deserved to know the truth, and that everyone would be better off without him. I know that was the depression speaking, not the man he truly was. To this day, I've never told my mother about the note. I know it would devastate her. Story 22. It's kind of disturbing when I think about it. My great-grandmother went into the military after committing a crime, and while she was serving, she confessed to a judge. Instead of prison, her punishment was an extended military contract, and she was forced to serve in the war. I didn't know any of this until long after she had passed, when I asked my dad about it. As it turns out, there was a guy in her neighborhood who was targeting children, mostly boys. One day, when she caught him trying to grab two young boys, she attacked him, severely injuring him and beating him badly. Story 23. I had a brother who had some paranoid delusions, FBI, CIA following him, spying on his apartment, etc. We, my brothers and I, had tried to get him help, and he would just have no part of it. After a few years, it seemed like it had gotten better. He stopped bringing it up, and we felt like it must have just passed. After he passed away, we found his journal, and it was just horrifying. Right up until the night he passed away, he detailed all of the torture that they were inflicting on him. Weird things that I can't even write in here. It was just incredibly disturbing to read what a tortured life he was living inside his mind while acting relatively normal outside. Edit. Many people have asked me to go into more detail on what he wrote. I can't go into much detail, it's hard for me to write about. Briefly, he believed that they were using some type of focused energy beam to torture him. They focused on different parts of his body at different times. Every noise that an appliance made was proof of electronic surveillance. Every bump on the wall or person walking in an adjacent apartment was a message from either the bad FBI agents or the good FBI agents. Story 24. My grandfather never talked much about his teenage years. All he told me was that he grew up on the island of Java in the 1940s, even though he was German-Dutch. When he passed away, he left me the autobiography he had written for after his death, and it completely blew me away. Apparently, his father, my great-grandfather, whom I'm named after, was a radio engineer for the Dutch government, building long-range radio stations. My grandfather and his siblings were attending boarding school in the Black Forest in Bavaria when their parents discovered he had been forced into the Hitler Youth. They immediately took the three kids to Java. Things were calm until the Japanese invaded. They went straight to their cottage, having learned my great-grandfather's work as a radio engineer. The family was taken hostage so he could build stations to support the Japanese invasion. At 16, my grandfather was separated from his family and placed in 6 different prison camps over the course of the war. By 1945, at the end of the war, he was in a camp outside Kyoto. At 22, he stood 6'3" but weighed only 83 pounds. When the emperor surrendered, the Japanese were ordered to surrender to the highest-ranking Westerner nearby. Since my grandfather was the oldest in the camp, he was put in charge of the camp and its 300-strong garrison for 3 days until U.S. Marines arrived. He had spent those days planning a trip to Kyoto, but the Marines showed up just 1 day before he could go. He was then taken to the USS Missouri to witness the signing of the peace treaty and later to a U.S. Naval hospital in the Philippines to regain his health. That's also where he developed a lifelong love of pancakes. They fed him them to get him back to a healthy weight. I had never known any of this until I read his autobiography. Along with it, he left me an incredible collection of family history and memorabilia, a detailed genealogy tracing our family back to 1276, a ball cap from the USS Missouri, a field jacket given to him by a Marine, and my favorite, a pamphlet dropped over his prison camp in 1945 announcing the end of the war and the coming liberation. Story 25. My grandma, my dad's mom, was one of my favorite people before she passed, when I was 14. She was kind, generous, and always gave good advice. My brother and I stayed with her often and were alone with her a lot. She never mistreated us or acted in any way unusual. Only a couple of weeks ago, at 33, I found out the truth. She was a severe alcoholic, drinking almost daily up until her death. My dad said she would get aggressive with him and his brothers as kids, and even as adults, she would hurl psychologically abusive taunts at them with a grin. I never had the slightest idea, despite growing up with an alcoholic stepdad and a nearly alcoholic mom. Story 26. Not exactly disturbing, but it definitely raised questions. When my great-oma passed away last year, we found a photo album she had hidden in a closet, full of pictures from World War II. She never talked about it, but from the photos, it looked like my great-oma may have been a Nazi, and they seemed to live a fairly lavish life during the war. It caused a bit of a rift in the family, but we still don't know the full facts. We do know that my great-opa was captured in France, and after the war ended, they moved to Canada. Neither of them ever talked about the details. Edit. My mom and I tried Googling my great-opa's name, although we suspect he may have changed it when they moved. We found records of his brother who passed away in battle, but nothing on him. They had a common last name, and my oma, my great-oma's only child, doesn't even remember much about her parents before coming to Canada. She was 4 or 5 and was basically told not to ask. As someone who loves history, I found it fascinating. For all we know, they could have been forced into joining. Although my mom suspects they supported the Nazi Party based on their personalities and some odd comments they would make. I wish I had more answers, but reading everyone's comments and stories has been amazing. Story 27. In my town, a woman passed away. And while people were clearing her garden, they found what they thought was a model skeleton. It turns out, it wasn't a model. Her husband had mysteriously gone missing in the mid-1990s. She was well-liked in the small town and always told people he had run off with another woman. She had a meticulously kept garden with delicate orchids and was very protective of it, not letting visitors in to avoid trampling the flowers. The woman who found the skeleton, a teacher, I think, first thought it was just a model wrapped in plastic, but then she noticed liquid and a terrible smell. The area faced the street, so forensic tents were up for weeks while they investigated. It feels strange, knowing I walked within 5 meters of a missing and murdered man for years while going to school. Story 28. I've never actually told anyone this, but my dad passed away about 20 years ago when I was 15. He worked installing skylight glass for large buildings like malls. At the time, we were told he passed away in a forklift accident. A crate tipped, he tried to stop it, and no one helped. It wasn't until 3 years ago that I learned the truth from a guy my dad worked with. There had been no accident. It was just my dad and that coworker, closing up shop. My dad had been talking about self-harming with him, and when the guy turned his back, my did it. The coworker had staged the forklift story so we, the kids, would get an inheritance and a lump sum payment. I cried for days when I found out, but even though it's a heartbreaking truth, I'm thankful to Clark for setting that up. You didn't have to, but you did, and it changed our lives for the better. Story 29. My cousin, only a few months older than me, passed away tragically and unexpectedly. We weren't super close, but it was a huge shock and devastated her immediate family. About 6 months after she passed, I learned something surprising. My brother, a police officer, had randomly pulled her over about a year before she passed away. He didn't know it was her at the time, but during the stop, she blew well over the legal limit and faced drink-driving charges. Her family, who always tried to appear perfect, refused to accept she might have had a drinking problem. They even tried to claim my brother had falsified the results out of a non-existent family grudge and attempted to have him fired. It didn't succeed, but it made his life miserable for a while. Her family doesn't know I know this, and I've struggled with whether to tell them, balancing the truth against the grief her death already caused. Story 30. My father often talked about being there with my mom for her last dying breath. It wasn't true. The truth is, my brother-in-law, who was abusive and unstable, was frantically searching for his wife, my sister, because she had been away from home too long. He called my father in a panic, assuming she was somewhere cheating. While my dad was trying to calm him down, my mother passed away. By the time he returned, she was gone. A few years later, when my brother-in-law passed away, I was surprised that my father didn't seem upset. Before my dad passed away, a few years after that, he finally told me why. I was in my mid-30s when I learned the truth. Story 31. One of my cousins was fatally attacked when I was 12. At the time, my parents told me it was a gang initiation. A few years later, I learned the truth. My cousin was married, but he was actually on his way to see his mistress, and the killer was most likely her boyfriend. The incident happened in the Philippines, and the police didn't investigate, but my family believes he was the one responsible. Shockingly, the man even attended my cousin's funeral. Knowing this doesn't change how I feel about my cousin or the good times we shared, but it does make his death feel more avoidable. Before, it felt like a tragic accident, something out of his control, but now it feels like a consequence of choices he made. On a brighter note, he left behind 2 beautiful children, one from his wife, one from his mistress, and they share a sibling-like bond, which is comforting to see. Story 32. Not sure if this really fits, but here goes. My grandma passed away a year or 2 ago, and after the funeral, the family gathered at my grandpa's house. My aunt asked me about my studies, and I mentioned some research I'd been doing on the Irish language. Out of nowhere, my grandpa pipes up, "Oh, I spoke that with Grandma and Grandpa, his parents' names back in the day." I just froze and asked if he was serious. He was. Apparently, none of my aunts or uncles had known either. They were just as shocked. He hadn't spoken a word of it around them for over 60 years. Turns out, he kept quiet because my grandma worried that if anyone knew he wasn't fully Americanized, they might not have been allowed to adopt kids. So in a way, she was responsible for keeping the secret that her husband wasn't 100% American. Story 33. A few years ago, my grandfather passed away, and then my dad. While searching for my father's family, my cousin and I started reaching out to that side. She was my father's sister's daughter. We went to a family reunion in another state and met our grandfather's cousins and aunts. My grandfather had been an abusive alcoholic who essayed his daughters. He even fired a gun through his front door to beat his wife after she kicked him out. My father, as a child, had to climb out a window to get help. According to the family, he got married and essentially disappeared in the 1960s, cutting contact completely. But when I shared the stories I knew, one male cousin became visibly upset and said, "He was a good man, and we don't talk like that about our family." The rest of the day was spent ignoring or excusing his behavior. I've never gone back. I want nothing to do with people like that. Story 34. This past summer, I went to a funeral for my aunt's mom, someone I'd never met or even known about. During the eulogy, one of the deceased's daughters talked about what loving and loyal parents she had and how their happy marriage shaped her upbringing. As soon as we got in the car, my mom and grandma started ranting about how much of that was complete BS. Apparently, the deceased had hated her husband, hadn't lived with him for over 30 years, and for 20 years before that, they barely even spoke. It's funny how much fluff people put into eulogies. Makes me hope I live a long life so people won't feel the need to lie about me after I'm gone. Story 35. I had these great aunts who all shared a house their entire adult lives. None of them married, and they were extremely overbearing, especially when it came to my granddad, their youngest brother. The second eldest was particularly belligerent and argumentative, and got more so as she aged. Some memorable moments, she loudly sang, "God Save the Queen," when meeting my Irish aunt for the first time, and she'd slip whiskey into everyone's tea and coffee, whether they wanted it or not. Most of the family stories we knew came from her, since she outlived the rest. One story she told was that my granddad had caused the death of his baby sister. She claimed he picked her up, dropped her because he was so small, and she hit her head. Then, she said, the eldest sister was offed by a tram while crossing the street to post the obituary. When the second eldest passed away, we cleared out her house and found tons of family documents, including birth and death certificates. It turns out the baby actually passed away of whooping cough, and the eldest sister didn't die posting an obituary. She lived another 10 years. My granddad let these false stories stand, believing them or not, and it's crazy to think about how many facts we accepted as truth. On top of that, we found some old photos of the second eldest with a group of women in what looked like army uniforms, but the armbands had been carefully cut out with a craft knife. We have no idea what that was about, and those were some of the few family photos she didn't burn. It's confusing, frustrating, and a little maddening, like the entire family history was a puzzle with half the pieces deliberately missing. Story 36. I recently learned about a great uncle I didn't even know existed. My mom barely remembered him. One day, my grandma just said, "My brother passed away. I'm going to his funeral in Iowa." We were upset, thinking Uncle B had passed, until she clarified, "Oh no, the other one, Uncle M." Apparently, she'd been no contact with him for almost her entire adult life because he had essayed her and her sister growing up. Understandably, it was complicated. We did get a curved TV from his belongings, but no one had room for it, so it went to a family friend instead. On a lighter note, my great-grandpa on my dad's side passed away in 2015. After the funeral, we all gathered at his house and discovered he was incredibly tech-savvy, even at 84. He had passwords for everything, usually based on poems he liked. But the real shock, while searching for anything to avoid paying to hack into his accounts, we found 5 boxes of Cadbury eggs and 2 gallon-sized Ziploc bags full of hard caramels hidden above his computer. Everyone knew Grandpapa had a sweet tooth, but not even his wife knew about this secret stash. By the time 20 cousins and siblings were done dividing it up, there was nothing left. Story 37. After my mother passed away, at the wake, her oldest sister Jay screamed at their father, "My grandpa, it should have been you." Granted, she was grief-stricken and he'd been ill, so you could forgive that outburst. But then my grandma, my mom's mom, piped up and said, "Thank God it wasn't Mary." Mary is my mom's second oldest sister, who had always been the favored child of all my grandma's other kids. When Grandpa finally did die a year later and everyone was upset at his funeral, Grandma made a point to come up to me and all my cousins to say, "It's okay. You don't need to be sad. I never loved him anyway." Grandma loved to brag to people about how she was leaving all her grandchildren money when she passed away, and she made sure everyone knew that if they fell out of her good graces, she could write them out of the will. I was so sick of this cold-hearted woman, but I did nothing to kiss up or to distance myself. When she finally passed, we all got $300 savings bonds. I bought a washing machine. Story 38. My grandma always told me that her youngest brother had passed away in the army when he was just 18. After she passed away a few years ago, I started researching our family through one of those online memorial websites. Our family is really fractured and scattered, so there aren't many people I can ask. That's when I discovered her brother had actually lived for decades in a nearby town. There's nobody left in my family. I truly trust to tell me what really happened, but I remember overhearing my grandma once share that she had been essayed as a young woman. I can shake the feeling that her own brother might have been involved. If that's true, I completely understand why she would have treated him as though he were gone, why she would have erased him from our lives. I never tried to contact his family out of respect for her. Whatever the real story was, I believe she must have had a very good reason to keep that door closed. Story 39. This isn't as dark as some stories I've heard, but I found out my father, encouraged at least in part by my stepmom, had been fraudulently using my social security number for loans and credit cards. Because I'm a junior, most of it didn't raise any red flags at the time. He also worked as a credit manager for a few banks and hospitals and even ran a collection agency twice. So he had a lot of connections who didn't always look too closely at the paperwork he was submitting. I'm still cleaning up some of the mess he left behind, though it's slowed down since he's been gone for over a decade. Every now and then, though, I still get a call from someone trying to collect on an old debt they bought. What I struggle with the most is that this was the same man who preached honesty and integrity to me my whole life and would punish me harshly if I stepped even slightly out of line. After he passed, I realized he had some serious issues, but it's still hard to reconcile who he told me to be with who he really was. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.